I appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedule to attend the launching of the Harold V. Lucas Jr. Foundation. I would like to thank everybody that is making this event possible at this time.
At this time, we will have the Negro National Anthem by Ardelia J'Nell.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat and not our weary feet, come to the place for which our Father sighed. We have come over a way with the tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou that hast brought us thus far on the way, Thou who hast by thy mind led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, and lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, might we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
At this time, we'll have the occasion by Mr. Lynn Thompson.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Lynn Thompson. And, I hope you can hear me. I'm Lynn Thompson, and I happen to to serve as a member of the foundation. And my job, right now I'm the vice president for intercollegiate athletics at Bethune-Cookman University. But quite frankly, I am who I am because of the influence and impact of Coach Harold Lucas. And I'm honored to be here. Imagine this. As a boy, you've been blessed to grow up in an era where faith, family, friends, and integrity are far more valuable than things. And as a young boy, you grew to really believe that, in spite of what the world might have told you. And in your heart, you knew what was placed in your heart, even when the world was telling you something different, because your family emphasized that. And you leaned on that philosophy and learned also that the greatest act of leadership was that of serving others. So imagine that all through those years of service, the world opened up and offered itself to you through travel, financial opportunities, friends, and stories. And you took advantage of every one of them, fully knowing that one day the winds would return you back home to the sands of your birth. And you would have a chance to nurture your roots once again, to make sure that that cycle will repeat itself. Well, my friends, that is just what this is. Tonight is simply a celebration of a dream come true, of a boy from good soil with solid roots, about a boy who was a tree of sorts, who now has grown into a giant oak, right here in Midway, Daytona Beach. And those roots now have formed a foundation. And so we gather to witness tonight the birth of the Harold V. Lucas Jr. Foundation. And moreover, to pay tribute to the man who has given so much to all of us. And as I look here on my screen and I see the names of the people who are joining us, I know your stories too. He touched you just like he touched me. No one can deny what he means to our community and to his and to our families. And we thank God that this fertile soil of Midway Daytona Beach is now enriched once again by him for one reason, and that's to produce a new generation of leaders because of his great example. And so tonight, as we listen to people and we listen to his story, we are going to be reminded and challenged to follow his great example because it made all of us who we are. That's why we're here, and that's why we must follow his lead. Congratulations, Coach. I'm honored to serve alongside you in the foundation that bears your name. And now, let's take a look and a listen at the story of the tree that grew in Midway.
Have you ever wondered who writes history? Or for that matter, how it's made and recorded? They say that history is simply the passing down of stories about people's lives and how they impacted others. Well, if that's true, then here's a story of a boy from good soil who traveled the world, touched a lot of lives, and came back home to live and write his story. And it's called A Tree That Grew in Midway. The saga of Harold Lucas Jr. is as good as it gets. The only child born to Harold Sr. and Althea Beatrice Lucas. He was born in 1932 during the Great Depression in Midway, Daytona Beach, smack dab in the middle of the black community. He picked up his family values and work ethic from them, and they came in handy because young Harold would be forced to grow up far earlier than expected.
My father came to Daytona because of Bethune-Cookman College. Ms. Bethune was looking for an accountant to set up an accounting system for her school, and she asked his brother, who was working in Tuskegee, Alabama at the time, if he knew someone that could set up an accounting system for the school. My dad's brother said, yes, I know someone that can do it, but he won't be able to come until the spring because of a previous accident. So Ms. Bethune and my father communicated, and he came down to Daytona Beach, Florida in the spring of 1920 and began his career as an accountant at Bethune-Cookman University, or college at that time.
Traveling back and forth to New York was exciting for Harold. And so was the responsibility of driving his father around in a car many years before he was even able to earn a driver's license.
My driving my father around came about as a necessity because in 1942, he had been hospitalized and he had to go to the doctor. And I went up on the campus to see if I could find Grady James or Eddie Descheville, who used to drive him around during the school year. This being Christmas time, they all had jobs and I couldn't find any. So my dad said, well, Harold, you've been sitting in the car shifting the gears. And I said, don't you know how to drive? And I said, yeah, I know how to drive. And he said, well, I got to go to the doctor. So I got in the car and immediately backed the car out of the driveway, drove down Jefferson Street to Cypress Street, down Cypress Street to Pearl, and up into Dr. Hill's yard. And this was a stick shift Chevrolet on a dirt road. So that began my driving experience.
The early 1940s in Daytona Beach was an exciting growth period for the town and for the blooming young college with a dynamic woman leader who doted on Luke like her own son.
Ms. Bethune instilled in me a lot of personal things, habits and ideals and desires. Anytime that I would see her walking on the campus, I used to walk with her. And she would say things like, Harold, do you see that piece of paper over there? Go and pick it up for Mrs. Bethune. Because you see, we are a college that's founded on donations. And if someone was driving down the street and they saw that piece of paper over there, they might not give us any money. But if they saw it, because first impressions mean a lot. And so I learned about first impressions.
He saw the value of leadership with dignity from Dr. Bethune, and he learned the business skill to lead and serve his community from his dad. Some folks say that we're the sum total of all of the great people who have coached and inspired us. But who's inspired Luke? Furthermore, what are his plans for his foundation?
It is my hope that the foundation will become an integral part of the community, because I feel the need for people being able to be exposed to certain things that I am in hopes of the foundation presenting or giving us. For example, we're going to have quarterly community meetings that will remind us of meetings that Bethune used to have in which they discussed all kinds of issues. We're going to have a scholarship program which will enable young people in the community to go to receive a scholarship to go on to college. And then there will be a display of different things that have happened in the community since its inception, and hopefully it will make us realize how important the past is to us. Because if we don't have any vision of the past, then we might not know where we're going to go in the future or how we can better go where we need to go in the future.
He's been a soldier, a champion, a coach, administrator, father, community leader, author, master storyteller. Well, how does he want the final chapters of his life story to be written?
The purpose of the foundation is to acknowledge the past, enhance the present, and contribute to the future. The future being all of the young people that will come behind us in the Midtown area.
You know, they say that history is simply the passing down of stories about people's lives and how they impacted others. Well, it must be true, because I read it in a book about a boy who traveled the world, touched a lot of lives, and he came back home to write and live his story in Midway.
What a powerful video. I mean, this just captures everything about Mr. Lucas. I'm just so proud of you, Mr. Lucas. We talked about this many years ago. He talked about just wanting to start his foundation after the model of Mrs. Bethune's foundation. And I'm Ashley Robertson Preston. I am an author, a lecturer at the University of Florida. And my relationship with Mr. Lucas started a few years ago when I was working on a book on Mrs. Bethune. And when I came to Daytona and I was working at Bethune-Cookman at the time, I met all of these people who knew Mrs. Bethune. And Mr. Lucas was one of those people. And I interviewed him for my book. And he talked about the profound impact that she had had on his life. And it really just touched me, just to see that, you know, she had planted these seeds, to read that she had planted all of these seeds in the community, and to see how Mr. Lucas's life turned out. He's a philanthropist. I mean, he gives from his heart. He's done so many great things in the community. He served his country. He's been a coach for decades. So many things I could say about him. And I just want to say thank you, Mr. Lucas, because he's a coach on and off the field. He coached me a few years ago when he asked me to write his book, to co-write his book, my apologies. He came to me, he said, "Can you write this book?" I said, "Mr. Lucas, I don't do that. I don't think I can do it." And he came back to me a few months later and he said, "Can you write my book, or do I need to find somebody else to write my book?" And he believed in me when I didn't believe in myself regarding the book. And it just turned out beautifully. And we had a great time doing it. And I'm just so excited to see that all of the things that he's been thinking about are coming to pass with this foundation, and to see that he is taking control of his legacy, and he is doing it now, not waiting for anyone, but doing the work himself as he has always done. And so I'm really excited to be here tonight. And it's only fitting that we would do this on Black History Month. Black History Month for a history maker like Mr. Lucas. And so this is exactly what Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the person who founded Negro History Week, now Black History Month, this is exactly what he wanted us to do. He wanted us to come together. He wanted us to recognize the accomplishments of great men and women, and we should build on those traditions. So this launch is totally in line with what Dr. Woodson would have wanted. And so you are truly in for a treat tonight. We have Dr. Kimberly Brown Pellum, a 4-time author, one of the most brilliant women that I know, one of my Howard University sweet sorors. Dr. Kimberly Brown is an author, professor, and the founder of the History Consultants Boutique Agency. With a PhD in United States history from Howard University, she specializes in the history of women's images, Southern culture, and the Black freedom struggle. Her contributions to publicly accessible history include work at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, the National Park Service, the Rosa Parks Museum, and Google's Arts and Culture series. Dr. Brown Pellum is the author of Black Beauties, African-American Pageant Queens in the Segregated South, and she currently serves as a faculty member in the Department of History at Florida A&M University. Welcome, 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 Dr. Kimberly Brown Pellum.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Preston. It is an honor to share space, although it is not physical, to be in the presence of Dr. Lucas means quite a bit to me as well. As Dr. Preston mentioned earlier, indeed, not only are we colleagues, but she is someone who I absolutely consider a close friend. And given the years-long relationship that we've had, I was aware of her contributing to Mr. Lucas's book. In fact, I had a chance to look over some of the content prior to it being published. And when I tell you your story really stirred me, it did. Words cannot capture what it meant to have my eyes be privy to your legacy before the rest of the world. And so just as I felt privileged then to take a look at your book, I feel privileged now to do this in your honor and in the spirit of your foundation. But first and foremost, Ashley mentioned that I am a graduate of Howard University, and I am. However, my two most important degrees come from Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. And I just had to underscore that because I know I have some Bethune-Cookman people in the house, and I just wanted to make sure that I represented appropriately. So go Rattlers before I begin. That said, because reading Mr. Lucas's story meant so much to me, I kind of wanted to frame this evening's conversation in such a way that speaks to Mr. Lucas's legacy and his imprint, not only in Florida, but nationally. And so I'm going to title my talk, Carter G. Woodson, a Playbook, in the spirit of Mr. Lucas being an athlete and leaving such an incredible influence, as I stated, all over Florida and especially in the Daytona area. I kind of wanted to roll with the theme of being an athlete. And one thing that every athlete needs is his playbook. So we'll start from there. I'm going to share my screen with you all. If Dr. Preston would give me permission to share my screen, I'd appreciate it. I am going to share just a few slides that I helped to produce along with the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. While I worked at the Smithsonian, I had an opportunity to do a few collaborative projects, and the National Postal Museum was one of them. So I'm going to share this project that I did with them with you all. So I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully you see Dr. Woodson as the genesis of Negro History Week. And the words read, when there were no academic journals to counter racist scholarship, Dr. Woodson created one. When no professional presses would accept materials about African Americans, he founded one. And so these set of slides really explore Dr. Woodson's contributions to the study of Black history. He legitimized and popularized the history of African American people through his establishment of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, referred to today as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. In 1915, and the organization's subsequent launch of Negro History Week in February 1926, when mainstream history either largely ignored or debased the Black presence in the American narrative, Dr. Woodson labored to inject a fair portrayal of African Americans into the national record. A Harvard graduate, Dr. Woodson produced his dissertation with university professors Edward Channing and Albert Bushnell Hart as committee member and dissertation advisor, respectively. The two plainly expressed their convictions about African Americans as inferior. Hart paternalistically encouraged education as a mechanism for improving what he believed was an innate intellectual inadequacy within African Americans. Channing bluntly argued that the Negro had no history, and according to Woodson, found laughable the idea of Crispus Attucks and his role in the Boston Massacre as an important contribution to the independence of this country. Channing challenged Woodson to undertake research that the Negro had a history. Woodson, however, had already taken up that challenge long before arriving at Harvard and continued to do so for the rest of his life as an educator and a prolific scholar. He meticulously researched, wrote, and published innumerable works on almost every aspect of Black life. Despite his earlier efforts taking place during what many scholars refer to as the nadir, or the lowest point in American race relations, his work sparked a mass movement to recognize and celebrate Black resilience and contributions to the United States. When there were no academic journals, he created one to counter racist scholarship. When there were no professional presses that would accept materials about Black people, he established one. The Journal of Negro History, Associated Publishers, and what became known as Black History Month are among the crown jewels of Dr. Woodson's legacy. Still, Woodson viewed a yearly emphasis during 1 week, or now during 1 month, as entirely missing the point of his Negro History Week, which was to use this time as an overview of what should have been taught throughout the year, not to compensate for what was not. His mission was to emphasize the need, not Negro history, but the Negro in history. In other words, one cannot understand the foundation of American government, tax structure, or changing legislative developments without understanding slavery, its economic implications, and heavy influence on political identity. Civil War figures such as Stephen A. Douglas and President Abraham Lincoln go misunderstood without proper evaluation of their relationships with Black people. Science and technology, business and capitalism, Hollywood and popular media, urbanization and foreign policy will never be fully comprehended without consideration to the Black presence in America. Eminent scholar and social activist W.E.B. Du Bois lauded Negro History Week as the greatest achievement to arise from the Black Renaissance of the 1920s. Known as Black History Month today, it carries the incandescent legacy of its creator, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. In 2015, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History opened on the foundation of public access to Black history that Dr. Woodson built. May we all be moved to keep building the house of preservation and acknowledgement, even if it's just by sharing the history of Black History Month. And so with that, I see Dr. Woodson like Mr. Lucas, an all-star athlete, and we should follow his playbook. What are some things that you find in an athlete's playbook? One thing that you have to have, I think, as a winning athlete is an example. And Dr. Woodson in his own writings talks about his father being his ultimate example. And I find that incredibly interesting because Dr. Woodson, rubbed elbows with some of the most influential persons of his time, people like Du Bois, Elaine Locke, Mary McLeod Bethune. These are folks that Woodson interacted with. But his father, who worked in a salt mine and could not read and had experienced the terrors of slavery, was Dr. Woodson's example. I also think in order to achieve victory in life, a winner needs some hustle. Dr. Woodson had that. He wasn't able to go to school. Like most Black children who were one generation removed from slavery, Dr. Woodson was born in 1875, and like Booker T. Washington and other narratives that you'll find published around this era, is that he was forced to labor for his family in order to make ends meet. He talks about being so poor that at one point he had to eat grass. He talks about his mother having to wash what he wore one day early in the evening so that he would have it to wear early the next morning. And so with that kind of background and still being able to forge ahead and accomplish what he accomplished, he received his high school credits within a period of 2 years. Immediately thereafter, he goes on an international tour of sorts where he teaches in places like Honolulu. Again, this is just one generation removed from slavery. He moves beyond this stage of international teaching to now go into the PhD at Harvard, which is considered the apex of American education. And to do this within a span of a few short years really speaks to Dr. Woodson's hustle. As I mentioned earlier, his dissertation advisor said that African people had no historical record and did not deserve acknowledgement in the experience of humans around the world. And for him to forge on and say, I challenge you, I oppose that idea. And not only do I oppose it, but I will write with such venom that you have to accept what I say and award me the PhD from the very racist institution that said the research couldn't be done. That's a different kind of level of hustle. I also think that for us to be star athletes, right, as human beings, we need a little bit of muscle. And Dr. Woodson's muscle was obviously his mind. He wrote a number of books. He trained other influential people like Zora Neale Hurston, the poet Langston Hughes. These were young individuals who were around the DC area at the time. Zora Neale Hurston was pursuing a bachelor's degree at Howard, and they ultimately interned at Dr. Woodson's offices. And so he's able to mentor them and share his mind with the next generation. Dr. Woodson wrote a number of articles under his name, but what I find incredibly moving is that he wrote so much that what he would do is assign his articles to other people and allow them to receive credit for writing those materials in his own journal. That's how fierce of a thinker he was, how fierce of a researcher he was, and how fierce of a writer he was. Also think that in order to win in life, you need a little bit of focus. Dr. Woodson is well known among his circles for not having many friends and not engaging in much recreational activity. In fact, Du Bois wrote that it was difficult to eulogize him when he eventually passed. The only folks that were really known to have a relationship with him outside of the profession of history are people like Mrs. Bethune and kids in the neighborhood where he lived and worked. He was also so focused that even his time at Howard was short spent. He, for 2 years, he was at Howard, not only as a professor, but he helped to establish the graduate program in history. And I'm very proud to say that both Dr. Preston and I are the legacy of that program that Dr. Woodson established. That requires an incredible amount of focus, but beyond that, Dr. Woodson leaves after 2 years. He is so bent on making this association happen and really popularizing the concept of professional Black history that he leaves Howard in order to establish the association. And he is so focused and dedicates so much of his life to it that his office is no different from his home. The two are combined in one residence in the DC area. Also, in order to win, I think that we have to look at tape as athletes. You know, why do athletes look at tape? The point is to prepare for the next game. And so as we prepare for our futures, I want us to think about where we are now. We're in the age of misinformation. So much of what we believe comes from social media. So much of what we embrace comes from secondary sources, and I would argue third and fourth and fifth and sixth sources, so distant from the truth. But Dr. Woodson was someone who pushed our embrace of primary sources, interviewing people who had lived these experiences. In fact, many of his books were carried titles like The History of the Negro Church, and he would just simply interview people who had an influence on that tradition, the history of Negro migration. And he would sit down with people who had moved from southern areas of the nation into northern industrial cities. Also, popular narratives tend to emphasize individuals over people and over institutions. Dr. Woodson was never one of those folks. He understood that in order for Black history to work, in order for the public relations arm of his mission to work, because that's what Negro History Week was, it was a campaign. In the same way that organizations and companies launch campaigns now, that's what Negro History Week was to his association. And he understood that in order for them to be successful, he would need to cooperate with other organizations. And so what you find in Dr. Woodson's own history is collaborative efforts with people like Mrs. Bethune, institutions like the YWCA, institutions like Omega Psi Phi and other fraternal organizations. And so I hope that we embrace that idea again, understanding that while it is necessary and important to analyze the Martin Luther Kings and the Rosa Parks and the Harriet Tubmans, it's even more important to understand the communities out of which these people are born and how those communities ultimately formed networks to make success possible. Where are we now? There's an emphasis, and I would argue an overemphasis on men in terms of how history is disseminated now. Dr. Woodson, again, is someone who pushed against that early on, even in an era where women were expected to be seen and not heard. Again, I keep bringing up Mrs. Bethune, but it's important to do that, because she was one of the most outspoken women of her time and probably the most respected Black woman of her era. He understood the importance of cooperation and partnership with Mrs. Bethune. And as we move forward, I also think it's important that we think about other women who have made important contributions as it relates to cultural preservation. And so when we think about Zora Neale Hurston, we often think of her as simply an author. But one of the ways that Zora Neale Hurston is able to produce the important material that she does is to, again, in the spirit of Woodson, sit down with individuals who have these important lived experiences. In fact, if you Google the title Barracoon now, that is probably one of the most important resources that we have today as folks who work in the field of professional history and education. There are very few resources that we have in terms of individuals who carry not only the slave experience, but the post-slavery experience as well. And one of the most intriguing things about Zora Neale Hurston's work, Barracoon, is that the primary character in that work, Cujo Lewis, experiences Africa, recalls Africa, appreciates his identity as an African person, experiences slavery, and of course, emancipation. And it's just very rare in terms of primary source material. And so I think it's important that we lift Zora Neale Hurston and her work in helping us to preserve that kind of thing. And again, as we think about the contemporary moment and women who are doing the most important work in terms of cultural preservation, I wouldn't know as much as I do about Mrs. Bethune had it not been for two people. That is Dr. Joy Kennard, who is still with MPS and helped me gain the opportunity to intern at the Bethune House in DC, and Dr. Ashley Preston. You know, not enough is said about cultural preservation in the way of structures and physicality. And when I had the opportunity to visit Mrs. Bethune's home in Daytona, and the way that Dr. Preston not only cared for the materials, but had such a precise knowledge about each and every artifact in that home, really speaks to why it's important to not only have young people in place, but again, have women in place to tell these stories, because I guarantee you, you know, I got love for men. My husband is in the back taking care of my kids, but I guarantee you, a man would not have been able to interpret those materials in the way that Dr. Preston was. And so I am just so grateful for her work there. She too, like Woodson, trained young people under her. I got a chance to meet some of her interns. She did incredible grant writing work at the Bethune home there. Again, in this important labor of cultural preservation. And so with that, I'm just gonna close by offering you all the example of Louis Armstrong. Anybody that studies jazz really understands that Louis Armstrong is the most important musician in American history. It is what it is. And as a result, one of the most important musicians in the world. He helped to standardize jazz, right? And so we can't really say that a particular genre is invented by a person, but every cultural and artistic production has a place of origin. And in terms of standardizing and professionalizing jazz, Louis Armstrong is that standard. The same goes for Dr. Woodson. When you think about Louis Armstrong, he lived one generation away from slavery. He was a bridge to the modern civil rights movement. The same goes for Dr. Woodson. He's born in 1875, dies in 1956, I believe. And he gives us a lens into the Great Migration and what Black people were doing as they, again, moved out of these southern regions into more industrialized regions in the United States. And so in the same way that an informed listener of jazz must acknowledge the importance of Louis Armstrong, if we are going to call ourselves true students of history, then we have to be informed of the work and legacy of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And I leave you all with his words: those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of history and biography. And I am both inspired by Dr. Woodson and the legacy of Dr. Harold B. Lucas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown Pellum, for that very informative history lesson. I'm sure that many of us have learned some things. I know that I learned some things from that presentation. And my name is Attorney Delora Butts Lucas. I'm the eldest daughter of Mr. Harold B. Lucas Jr. And I just want to thank everyone for their participation. Dr. Ashley Robertson Preston and Mr. Lynn Thompson for coordinating this launch, all of the work that you put into it. Thank you to all of the participants. And we just want to give space for you all to be able to join us in the vision of the Harold B. Lucas Jr. Foundation to acknowledge the past, enhance the present, and contribute to the future. And so you can do so by going to the foundation's website, hvlucas.org. That's hvlucas.org, to make a donation, to be able to help to advance the things that you heard my father speak about earlier. And you'll also see on the website, more details about the programs and the things that we're doing. And, you know, my grandfather moved here in 1920. So this is a legacy that started 100 years ago. So if you feel so inclined, you can make that donation $100 or any variation of that denomination, 10 or 1,000. But we invite you to be a part of the journey. And I just want to take time as well to acknowledge the board members and officers of the foundation, my brothers, Harold III, David, Daryl, and DeWitt. And also again, Dr. Ashley Robertson Preston, Mr. Lynn Thompson, Mr. Larry Wesley, and Mr. Daryl Brown, Miss Huretta Wright, Mr. Barry Whitaker. Thank you all for your service. And there are two gentlemen that even before my dad officially launched the foundation, they actually sought him out when they saw an article in the paper last month. And they reached out to him, Mr. Mike Schumann and Mr. Jeffrey New, to say, we don't know what you're going to be doing, but whatever you're doing, we want to be a part of it, and gave sizable donations. And they shared stories with how my dad had impacted their lives in major ways when they were in high school. So we are just here to be able to continue on that legacy of service, athletics, academics, leadership, and philanthropy of Mr. Harold V. Lucas. So thank you again for joining us. And that website again is hvlucas.org. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Happy Black History Month, everyone.